If you're not familiar with EPZ yet, well, it might be time because this is their best IEM yet. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, I've been listening to the P50 for a couple of weeks now, and it is a $250 tri-bird IEM. It's got a single dynamic driver, a couple of balanced armatures, as well as two of these newfangled planar tweeters. But more importantly, I think that the P50 is kind of a breakout IEM for EPZ. This is a departure from what they've been traditionally doing in terms of the tuning. And frankly, I think that at 205 bucks, this thing is squarely in competition with things like the Kiwi Ears KE4 and even the binary Chopin. But how does it compare? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this review. But before we do that, a quick shout out to EPZ for sending in the P50 for review. If you want to check out this IEM or anything else they've got, I've got them linked in the description down below. But with that out of the way, let's go to the table. We'll talk about what comes inside the box, physical form factor, build quality, fit and comfort, and then we'll talk about the sound and bring in some of those other competitors for direct comparison before I wrap this review up with a conclusion. So here you go. Here's the box. Nice, simple packaging. Not too fancy, but what you get inside of it is exactly what you should expect for around 250 bucks. Put this IEM to the side for now. We'll talk about that in a bit, but you get a nice little carry puck, which I appreciate. You know, as far as all the different ways you can carry your IEMs, these are, I would say, probably one of my favorite. They're still a little bit large, not pocketable, but if you're going to throw it in a bag or put it aside to store your IEMs, this is definitely a nice way to do it. It just feels well built. It's got, let me pull the top off. It's got a nice soft interior, as well as some silica gel. Oh yeah. But we'll put that to the side and we'll talk about the other things that come inside the box, starting with a nice microfiber towel, a branded microfiber towel. This is a nice actual microfiber towel, and I feel like I'm being facetious right now, but I like the towel. But apart from that, you get, of course, a set of silicone ear tips. In fact, it seems like they include two sets of the same ear tips, right? This is just a pretty generic silicone ear tip. Of course, it comes in small, medium, and large, and they include two full sets of them. I'm not sure exactly why. Usually when an IEM includes multiple sets of tips, it's because, you know, you get a slightly different fit, slightly different shape. Here in this case, you've just got backups, I guess, in case you need them. Personally, you might notice I'm not using these ear tips, and I guess we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get into talking about the fit and comfort of this IEM. But yeah, that will mostly bring us into talking about the build quality and the cable. But I did want to highlight real quickly the fact that the cable does have a swappable termination, which is kind of all the rage these days. And frankly, I like this solution because I personally prefer a standard 3.5 mil connector, but I know a lot of people out there want their balanced connectors. So with this solution, you get both, and the mechanism for doing it is it's got a screw-on lock, which I appreciate. Some of these swappable terminations don't have a screw-based retention system, and that just means that the termination will fall off a lot of the times when I don't want it to. So this is, I think, a pretty good solution. It's a right angle connector, but it's actually a little bit smaller than most of the right angle replaceable terminations that you see out there. So that's an interesting solution there. But that will lead us into talking about the build quality on this IEM. And we're going to start with the cable. We're going to continue with the cable because frankly, we've kind of already started there. And aesthetically, I think this is a nice looking cable. I like the pure white. It's a little bit on the thin side. Let me zoom in on that so you can take a look. It is, you can see it's got a braid to it, and I like that the wire has, you can see almost like this like threading inside of it. So it's just generally a nice looking wire, and they still kept it pretty thin. Now the downside of this is that it does end up being a little bit on the stiff side and a little bit kink prone. Let me see if I can kink it up for you and just kind of give you an idea of it. Now, I'm not afraid of having done that because it works itself out very well, but just note that it is the sort of thing that if you're one to sleep with your IEMs, okay? Speaking from experience, there's a good chance you're going to wake up and the cable is going to be pretty kinked up. But again, you can see it works itself out. It's just a little bit stiff and memory prone because of that. But other features of this cable we can talk about. A nice small Y-split. I like that. We've got a chin slider, which pretty much just stays in place. You know, it's not super tight in place, but I would say this is a perfectly functional chin slider. And then of course, we've got our preformed ear hooks and standard 2-pin connections. You can see that the cable here does have a bit of a protrusion on the 2-pin connector, although the IEM itself does not really have a recess, so that what you do end up with is a slightly taller fitting connector here rather than something that fits nice and flush. So yeah, a little bit of a demerit there. Here's another thing. This one is actually something that bothers me more. I don't know if this bothers other people. Maybe this is just a me thing, but you see that it has the R indicator on this piece on the outside of the cable. I really wish that more cable companies were particular about making sure that the L and the R indicators end up on the inside so that when you're looking at from the outside, you don't see it. Again, does that matter? Not really, but I notice it, and I would prefer if it didn't do that. But yeah, apart from that, I guess that will lead us into talking about the earpieces themselves, which are definitely an interesting look. And I've gotten actually some pretty mixed feedback from other people that have looked at this IEM. Some people have said, wow, that looks awesome. That looks fantastic. Other people have said, wow, that looks kind of cheap. Personally, I think it's a cool look. What I would love to see from EPZ though, is just to like find a design language and kind of stick with it and like have, of course, not make every IEM look exactly the same, but like this is such like an editorial decision that it looks so much different than the other things they make that it does feel a little bit random. Whereas if you can make all your IEMs a little bit, have some sort of design language between them besides just having this logo. And I think this is a good place to start because it's pretty handsome looking. You might notice that it's got kind of a pretty vented outer shell. In fact, EPZ is in their marketing material describing this as an open back IEM. And I just kind of want to take a moment and clarify what that means for you. I think a lot of people are interested in having an open back IEM, and I think what people are expecting is to have an IEM where you can hear more of the outside world, that it occludes less of the sound outside of the IEM and just gives you kind of more transparent experience. That is not the case at all here with the P50, which is not to say that this is like a lie. This is open back. In fact, if I put my finger over the back of it, the sound of the IEM changes. Like this is affecting the tuning of the IEM, but it's not necessarily or at all really giving you an added window into the outside world outside of the IEM. It's occluding and blocking out just as much sound as you would normally expect. Apart from that, the shell itself, I'll give you a fit demonstration in a little bit, but it is actually a little bit on the small side. This is, I would call a medium small shell, which might not come across entirely here in isolation, but when I bring in some of the other competitors, I think you'll notice this thing is quite compact, and that is, I think, a welcome move. It is still a fairly opinionated semi-custom shape. You can see that this wing back here is a little bit on the aggressive side. For me, it works out quite well, but because of the opinionated shape, as always, it might vary depending on your ear. And before, again, we get to the head fitting, I will also take off the ear tip and just highlight that the nozzle in this is a little bit on the long side, and that's why I'm not using the stock ear tips. This is a shorter ear tip. I believe it is a NF Audio MS42 ear tip. And just because it's a little bit on the shorter side, I find that this actually works better for me in fitting in my ear. So your mileage may vary as always with that sort of thing. But yeah, I guess I would like to see manufacturers more frequently include tips that match the IEM. I feel like they just kind of usually use the same kind of generic ear tips for all their IEMs. But I think that the shape of the IEM ends up requiring a different ear tip fit. At least for me. Before we move on, I will also take a moment to pull out the calipers and measure the nozzle on this IEM for you. Let's see, let's square it off, zero it out at 0. I believe I measured this at 5.5 mil. So let me just validate that here for you on the stream. Yeah, it's about 5.5 mil in diameter, and at 5.5, hold on, can I get the IEM through it? Yes, so about 5.5 mil. Nozzle-wise, I would say that that is a pretty nice, moderately sized nozzle. I don't think people are going to have issues with the nozzle on this. I think more so people might have issues with the length on the nozzle. And again, my recommendation would just be to find a shorter ear tip and use that on it, because I think that will help quite a bit. But with that out of the way, let me throw this thing actually in my head. Hold on, let me untangle it. I've wrapped it around itself. I'll throw it in my head and give you a fit demonstration as it appears in the ear of a typical human. And there you go. Like I mentioned, it's kind of like a medium small size. And because of that, like I feel no discomfort from this thing, you know, pushing outer pressure on my ear. The wings and the editorialization of the shape works well with my ear. Fit stability is actually quite nice. And, you know, the length, again, could be an issue, but you can see here with the shorter ear tip, I don't have any issues with the length pushing the IEM outside of my ear, you know. It's not the most flush fit, but this is a pretty nice fit. I'm very, very happy with the fit here on the EPZ. Again, just a note though, it's open back. I'm still, my voice right now sounds occluded because it is still a typical closed volume on the front side is what I'm guessing. But anyway, anything else to talk about physical form factor? Let me check my notes real quick, but I don't think so. Nope. we don't have anything else to talk about there, so we will now talk about the sound here on the EPZ P50 as I wrap this thing up, get it presentable again for y'all, and then take it away, because we're going to go over to SquigLink instead. Hold on, where did my squigs go? Here we go. Let's take a look at SquigLink. So if you want to check out this frequency response graph, I've got it up on SquigLink, linked down below, but let's do a little bit of analysis together. And this is where this is like kind of a departure from what EPZ has been doing. They have been doing just kind of traditional V-shaped sound signatures. You know, there's a little bit of departure with like the 530, but still a version of a V-shaped sound signature. Whereas here with the P50, I mean, you see my dark dotted line back there? That is my target. And you can see this red line is following that target quite a lot. I think you could very squarely say that this IEM is tuned in line with a lot of the new meta, right? This is sort of a tilted diffuse field sound signature that is going to sound pretty much neutral and natural, I think, to most people. There are a couple of departures here. Honestly, most of the departure is down here in the bass. There's a little bit of a bass boost here. And unlike, well, okay, let me step back and say that there's been a lot of these tilted diffuse field sound signature IEMs in the last year or so, and they all have some sort of bass boost, right? This one is more so sub-bass oriented, all right? And we'll probably see this one. I don't know if I'm gonna pull up the frequency response of the KE4. If you wanna check it out, again, go to SquigLink. You can compare it with all other IEMs. But the KE4 and even like the MegaFest, while they're very similar up top, the bass boost on those is gonna start quite a bit sooner here, like around like 200 hertz. And that just gives them a pretty distinctly different sound. How I would say that this sounds to me, which is actually interesting in comparison to some of those other tilted diffuse field sound signatures, is it sounds a little bit contrastier than I would expect. So it doesn't sound exactly V-shaped, but it still sounds a little bit contrasty and a little bit less mid-range focused than some of those other tilted diffuse field IEMs. Something else that might be contributing to that, and this is a hard thing to say, is that in my ear, well, sorry, I don't know what exactly is happening in my ear. I did do some frequency response sweeps, and it seems like I'm getting a little bit more elevation around 4K versus 3K necessarily. It would seem like it was peaking around 4K. But as I measure this thing, if I don't insert it as deeply, this will start to rise. You'll start to get some emphasis here in kind of the lower treble region. And I suspect that's probably what's happening in my ear. Not to the fullest extent of it, because it does still seem to peak for me around 7.5, 8K. So I'm still getting some emphasis here around where I should be. Well, where I would if I'm matching the frequency response of the measurement rig. But nonetheless, I have the suspicion that I'm getting a little bit more elevation here in kind of this lower treble region, which just gives it, again, a little bit of that added contrastiness, especially to vocals, that gives it just a nice, clear, distinct sound, but still sounding very much within the realm of natural and neutral. So let's get more into my personal kind of impressions of the sound, which is generally quite good, okay? I mentioned up top, this is, I think, EPZ's best sounding IEM, and frankly, I don't think it's close. This is a really excellently done IEM, whereas their other stuff has been ranged from like kind of too much, just a little bit too contrasty, a little bit too sharp, to, yeah, just okay, like kind of the middle of the road. The P50 is not middle of the road. This is definitely better. That contrastiness that I described, it does make vocals, it brings them a little bit forward and maybe gives them a little bit of an over sharpened edge. And I think because of that kind of elevated, 4 to 5K that probably I'm getting inside my ear. The benefit of that, however, though, is you get a nice sense of contrast, which gives you a nice sense of stereo separation. The distinction between sounds is very, very clear in this IEM, and it does give you more of kind of that stagey effect than you might get in a lower contrast version of this tilted diffuse field sound signature. In some ways, this actually kind of reminds me of the SIMGOT EM6L. If you look at them on a graph, they're not entirely the same. I think the EM6L is actually a little bit bassier, but the EM6L in a similar way always sounded to me a little bit contrastier than at graphs, and I feel like I get a similar effect here with the EPZ P50. I don't think it's quite as contrasty as the EM6L, but if you've heard that IEM, hopefully that helps you understand what I'm describing. And if you haven't heard that IEM, well, I apologize, but we'll get into some other comparisons. Hopefully those will make sense for you. In terms of the treble tuning on this IEM, apart from that range that can vary depending on insertion depth. I would say that the upper treble on this should not be an issue for sensitive listeners, people who are sensitive to upper treble boost. I would say that the high frequency percussion on this, things like hi-hats and cymbals, not quite ideal in terms of its timbre. Like, it doesn't quite have that weight behind them, but it is very, very well done. I'm thinking like the Parcels live album, for example, is a set that I go, or a song I go to a lot to test this sort of thing. Or also the Smashing Pumpkins, they have a track called Suffer. Got really, really nice high frequency percussion that comes across okay on this headphone. It's not going to be problematic for anybody in terms of fatigue, but it's also just, it doesn't quite have that weight behind it that some other sets might have. But again, $205, certainly not the most expensive set out there. The bass emphasis on this set I would also describe as like pretty well controlled. It is, like I mentioned earlier, it's not an early bass boost. Like, it is mostly sub-bass focused, so it has more of a bounce to it than kind of like a full throated kick drum kick to it, right? Yeah, it's got pretty decent definition because of that. It's not necessarily as like slammy as you might get in something like the Soft Ears Volume S that I recently reviewed, but certainly not bad at all. It's just more of a bouncy bass, okay? And then if I were to critique the sound of this thing, because like mostly I've got positive things to say about this thing, it's just, I think that contrastiness does give it more of this macro contrasty sound that plays down some of the micro contrast. So if I'm listening to textured vocals and stuff like that, I don't think that's necessarily where the P50 does its best, which is a little bit of a bummer just because of the frequency response that this thing is going for. Like, I feel like in my mind, why that's my target is I love the way that kind of subdued low contrast sound can bring out the micro contrast and really pull out the texturing and just all the nuance of vocal content. I think the P50 does an okay job of that, but the macro contrastiness of it can overpower that a little bit. And while the bass balance I think is generally pretty good on this, it can be a little bit too bassy still for me, a little bit distracting if I'm going for that neutral sound signature. Now, as you see, the things I'm going to bring in to compare against this thing, this is actually probably the least bassy of the bunch. But if you're looking for that purely neutral sound signature, the bass can be a little bit on the distracting side. But enough of me talking about bringing in comparisons. Let's actually do the comparison. Here's the Kiwi Ears KE4, which I believe is, hold on, what is the driver configuration on this? I think it's 3 balanced armatures and 1 dynamic driver, or is it 2 dynamic drivers and 2 BAs? I think that might be it, actually. But also around $200. And this is also going for a very similar sound signature, both kind of going for this tilted diffuse field nu meta sound signature. Now, what's interesting is that while they're very similar on a graph, you can certainly see where they deviate on the graph. And it's interesting to see those deviations, which might seem kind of minor, and then plug it into your ears and listen to it, because they do sound pretty significantly different. I mean, they're both good in that they're both within the range of kind of neutral and natural sounding, but the KE4 ends up sounding lower contrast versus the more macro contrasty sound signature that we get here on the P50. Specifically, like if you're listening to really busy tracks. So I listen to a lot of The Cure's Disintegration album, specifically the track Close Down. It just has a lot going on in that song. And here on the KE4, it can sound a little bit jumbled, whereas you listen to it here on the P50 and like the distinction and the imaging and the positioning of all the sounds is just a lot clearer and easier to make out on the P50. The potential downside is just that the micro contrast that I mentioned, this not necessarily doing that well. I do think that the vocal content is a little bit better here on the KE4. Which is interesting though, is that the treble on this again, like frequency response graph, it's hard to make up too much. It's hard to read too much into the treble measurements, but they don't look that far off. But what I do hear is that the KE4 comes across a little bit, the word I wanted to say is like frothier, right? It sounds like there's maybe a little bit more treble and it's a little bit less defined because of it. But I do think that the high frequency percussion ends up coming across a little bit sharper as long as it's not so busy. Again, it's in the busier tracks where the KE4's strengths start to falter a little bit. And then the biggest difference is that the bass emphasis here on the KE4 is quite a bit worse. That was my biggest concern, or my biggest complaint with the KE4, was the bass execution is just a little bit lackluster. It's a little bit, I don't know. I'm looking at the frequency response graph. I'm guessing it's because it starts too early. I haven't tried EQing it. Maybe I could fix it with EQ or something like that. But I just have to say that like the attack definition is not super sharp, whereas here on the P50, you do get that nice incisive attack on the bass that gives it that bouncy characteristic versus a slightly blurrier, slower sound that you get here on the KE4. Again, I think in a lot of ways, like they trade blows. Again, the strength here would be more in like the vocal content. I think that the KE4 does do a more natural, richer mid-range sound signature, whereas the P50 gives you just a more stagey, contrasty, stronger definition sound. And that's, again, it's interesting because of how similar they look in the frequency response range, but to ear, the small differences end up making a pretty big difference. And I guess the last thing I'll highlight here, just to highlight the size difference for you, the KE4 I would describe as kind of medium largish, and you can see versus the EPZ is quite a bit svelter. But that's not our only IEM for comparison, because I've also got, personally, my favorite IEM at around $200 still. This is the binary Cross Giz Audio Chopin. Driver config in this, I think, is 3 balance armatures in a dynamic driver, but I actually kind of forget. It's been a while since I even looked at that. But price on this is pretty similar, $200, $205. Sound signature on this is more different versus the KE4. This is not like a tilted diffuse field. This is, in fact, more tuned toward Harman, although it doesn't sound that Harman to me. This sounds a lot warmer and fuller than Harman typically does, and I think that's because it's got a pretty significantly boosted bass versus your traditional Harman. Of the bunch that I've pulled up here on the table as well, I would say that this is the bassiest of the bunch. And the bass is not just like a sub-bass focus like you get here, and it's not just kind of like the blurry, kind of messy bass that you got in the KE4. Here, it's a lot more mid-bass than you get here. And because of that, you get more of this kick drum thwack in the bass, right? But also, I don't know, it's really, really satisfying. I find the bass on the on the Chopin to be one of the standout aspects of this IEM. And you know, I just mentioned saying, I feel like this could use less bass. Well, this has got more bass and I like it better. So I'm maybe sounding a little incoherent here, but it's because this is going for, or at least what I would love to get from this is kind of, again, that more neutral, tilted diffuse field sound signature, whereas this is just going for something different. And I feel like it leans into it a little bit more, and it just ends up being, for me, the more satisfying overall presentation. I'm always really surprised when I go back to the Chopin how much I like this IEM. Is the bass here set, it's got that wallop to it, and overall it's just got kind of a more analog sound, that macro contrastiness that we get here from the EPZ that can give it a little bit of a digital, stagey sound, but a little bit digital, a little bit Dolby-ish. You don't really have here on the Chopin, and despite that, like, I still feel like this gives me a nice wide presentation, more of maybe an atmospheric sound versus like this black background contrasty sound that we get here on the P50. I think it's just because it probably does the micro contrast a little bit better. The imaging, I would say, on the P50 is cleaner and clearer, more distinct. Again, almost artificial in a sense, whereas here it's still nice and wide, more so deep though because of that bass presentation. And yeah, for me, the Chopin would still be my go-to pick at this price range, although the shape and the fit of it might be a little bit of a detractor for some people. Certainly not as good as the P50 that we've got over here. But that will lead us into my conclusion of the review of the EPZ P50. Just checking my notes, making sure I didn't miss anything, and I don't think I did. So out of 5 stars, the P50, I'm gonna give this one a very solid 4 stars out of 5. I think it is time for us to start paying attention to EPZ, and I'm very curious to see what they do next. Is this a sound signature that they're gonna double down on and kind of like dive deeper into doing and executing this better? They're gonna go back to kind of their V-shaped sound signature ways, or are they gonna, I don't know, give us some sort of mix-up? I don't know what they're gonna be doing. But this one, you should definitely check it out. If you're looking for something that fits fantastic, nice and small, and gives you a really nice, clean sound that is within the realm of neutral, but still gives you kind of that contrasty, stagey fun, the P50 is a very good pick. And if you want to check it out, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. While you're down there, if you haven't already, well, please do consider hitting the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked down below, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
This review is super. Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's begin with the pitch.